me going on and on about it.
The
But
$5 meal deal at
you mentioned
McDonald's
development
means
partners,
you
but,
get to
maybe
pick
expand
between a
on that a little bit.
McDouble
Who are some
or
of
a
the key
McChicken.
partners you've seen on the ground?
Then get a
who've
small
actually
fry.
done some transactions.
Yeah.
What's sort of in the scale of transactions that we're talking about here?
Okay, so just to give you a simple and practical example, you have the MasterCard Foundation, and I mean, they are doing very immense things in Ghana. Just before I left Accra last week, they had signed a $23 million contract with Design and Technology Institute. That's a client of Fidelity Bank. Okay, now what does Design and Technology Institute do? They go down to the grassroots and they pick up young girls, people who are on the streets, and then they solicit funding from MasterCard so that they can equip these young people with the right requisite skills. An interaction with an oil and gas firm on one occasion pointed to the fact that they had to actually import welders who can do precision welding. Okay, Ghana is now mining oil and gas. So they need people that can do precision welding. They need people that can fabricate to a certain high level of quality. And all this is imported. Meanwhile, we have the human resource. So what's Design and Technology Institute doing? They're going down to the streets, they're picking up young people, training them properly, giving them the right skills, and deploying them locally. The next level of that will be to export that within the sub-region, and then you can go global with it. So that's just one example. I don't think a lot of you knew MasterCard actually has that in place, and they actually deploy funding directly. There's a similar program that runs for just women and SME, and Fidelity actively participates in that. And there's a large pool of funding that's available for people to draw from once you have the right business model, and then you can roll out. Then there's the European partners, DEG, Propaco, etc.
Maybe Rossi, along those same lines, he had mentioned, John Paul had mentioned conduits. Investors are looking for these sort of, that sort of is akin to some, structure. What other structures are you seeing? What vehicles are people using for the capital that's coming in the areas that you talked about? Are they also doing conduits, or is there differences in structure that people are looking at in order to basically de-risk these transactions?
I actually think the question gets to a real problem that has an easy solution. Easy in terms of what can be done. Execution requires, and maybe it's people in this room to decide to do it. So if you're investing in any area, what you'd like to do is diversify your risk. And because investments are inherently risky, so the more investments you can do across the area, the more diversified your risk is. I'm sure Mark's going to tell us this. And so I don't want to take your thunder, but startup capital, which is what's really lacking, it's that beginning capital. And if it's structured the right way, then it sets off all these small businesses. Some will make it, some will fail, but structured the right way, the ones that make it will be the next businesses that are really poised to take the capital from John Paul and from other institutional capital, right? What we're missing is that initial group. In the US, that group is friends and family, and primarily it's been powered from people's home equity loans, okay? We don't have an equivalent on the continent that's been accessed yet. I would suggest that for this group, the equivalent for that on the continent is remittances from the diaspora. And why do I say that? Because that number is $54 billion a year, all right? At $54 billion a year that's being remitted, and then we all know that there's an extensive amount of fees. It's overpriced on the fee end. If you simply got 1% of that, or even a discount to that, let's do 10 basis points. At 10 basis points on 54 billion, help me with my math, but I think I'm working with something like, 54 million annually? That's a pretty good startup fund to be throwing money around on the continent, especially if it's being repleted every year. And I would suggest that itself, allocated consistently and properly, would just start flipping out businesses. And the amount of businesses you would flip out would give you a diversified pool of businesses, hedging the risk, And I would suggest that even the people in the room could probably organize a high-quality group of people that could screen those investments and could get that capital out. The issue is getting people to leave 10 basis points behind when they're sending money home. And I would suggest people like me who have no money to send home may actually want to participate in something like that. Because I was born in Yuma, Arizona. So that's, there's a challenge that has a solution, but it requires a larger group of people with certain tax abilities. The technology's there too, right? That's fintech.
I think you need a financial intermediary to be able to orchestrate that and put that together.
Right, because I'm not going to find every single deal for myself, given what I'm throwing out of investment. It's just transaction heavy. The transaction friction is too high for individual investors to do that.
Yeah. He's spot on. Because so that's where most commercial banks are positioning to trap, if you like, this sort of investment, because we understand what the risk is. We know who the right person is to deploy what capital to, and the better part is that it's coming at a cheaper cost, which is good for everybody, because if transactions within you're not able to get a high return in terms of your investment, you're pushed to move the money elsewhere, take that risk at a higher return, of course. And on the flip side, on the local side, even though it's coming at a relatively higher, it's much cheaper for you in your environment, because you won't see a loan. Currently, interest rates are probably around 8% on the dollar. That's SOFR plus a margin of 5.3. That's high. But if you come across capital that's coming at 3%, 4% per annum, it makes relatively good sense, and it's usually more stable, because you won't have a loan that's just 12 months, 48 months. You probably have something that's 5 years, 6 years, which you can probably plan and get a return on.
But you also need that equity sliver initially, because before you become revenue positive or revenue generating, you need someone who will just take the initial ride.
Correct.
And so it's like, just basically there's a life cycle of a company when it gets going, and we need the pieces of that capital stack.
Can I just add really quickly to that? There's another opportunity, I think, that is being maybe seeded here, and that is for the African diaspora to collectively start getting very intentional about focusing on the continent. And for those who have come from Africa more recently and come here to the United States, in a lot of respects, you are ambassadors for the countries from which you come. So there could be a potential business opportunity as speakers, as ambassadors, as advisors, to help educate the American public and the American investors about what the opportunities are and how to do business. This has been realized at the highest levels of the US government. You may or may not have seen the announcement about the president's new advisory council on the diaspora, right? So it's already being considered. It's just a question of how it gets leveraged. And I think that it doesn't get leveraged, sitting around a hollow square in the White House. It gets leveraged in the community level, at the grassroots level, from people that are willing to go back and to show what the opportunities are and to build the trust that is needed, because capital is going to go where there is organization and structure, but there has to be a foundation of trust, and there has to be a willingness to get there in the first place.
Camille, maybe you can even expand on that a little bit, because I think you mentioned in the beginning that part of your role was to take folks who are looking towards investing in the continent, who invariably tend to be more risk averse and have some preconceived notions around what it's like to do business in Africa, and oftentimes will end up shying from it. How do you convince them? How do you get over those risk hurdles or those perceptions? What are some of the tangible ways to be able to do that?
So I think one way is just outreach here within the United States at conferences like this one. And I'm glad that it's being streamed and just getting that word out more widely, and perhaps even showcasing the successful business cases, the successful business studies. And maybe you're even doing that at the university level. and at the grad school level, so that when people are going to B school, wherever they're going for that, they have that in mind, and they're like, oh, I can actually exploit this opportunity, or I can perhaps explore a niche or create a new niche. There's opportunities to create new niches with all of the technology that is now at our fingertips. The other way, I think, to get people who are skittish about sort of leaving the United States and getting on that plane and booking that hotel and spending thousands of dollars on logistics, never mind, just to get over there, trade shows. There are lots of opportunities at trade shows for both buyers and sellers to showcase what it is that they have to offer. So while you've got, innovations going on in the big sexy sectors that Jean-Paul mentioned, in energy and healthcare and infrastructure, in agribusiness, all those things are there. And there are opportunities to build value chains and supply chains. And in fact, when we had the US-Africa Business Conference in, I think it was 2022, we had 43 heads of state come over in December, right around the World Cup time, to Washington, D.C., because it was that important. And while there, people left with some skepticism about, will the United States actually finally come through? It's really not up to the people at the top of the food chain. It's up to the people at the base to decide that there's interest and there's opportunity, and to be interested in collaborating around shared values and shared vision. And that's the missing piece. You're not going to get your first mile unless you have some sort of a link. There has to be a heart and mind link to get people to start talking to each other. Once you start talking to each other, you can start building relationship, and you can start building trust, and then the resources follow, not the other way around.
That's very helpful. And Mark, maybe you can pick up on that, because obviously you work with a lot of individual investors. What are your thoughts on, we've heard remittances, we've heard building linkages and relationships. Oftentimes, certainly in my conversations with individual investors, you'll find that they don't even know where to start, or they don't even know that opportunities exist, whether it's Americans looking to do something in Africa, or even vice versa. More recently, you're getting a lot of Africans asking similar questions because of currency instability and some of the debt restructuring and challenges that we've had in our local economy. So how do you think about how the individual should approach this in terms of finding some of these opportunities?
Yeah, well, as a, wealth manager with individual clients, my interest is, my clients are top of mind interest-wise, right? So the first thing I would say is let's slow down, right? And let's make sure that all the basics have been taken care of first, because there's often a desire to invest, overseas, or go back and invest back home. And I think we're getting to the stage where we truly have global citizens, who, so if you're a professional mostly based here, you may have an opportunity to invest, back home in Africa, or if you're a professional in Africa and you've reached a certain level, you may have opportunities to do some investments, over here. So how do you navigate that space? And